So, and I do want to speak. It is an honor to be in this home where so much history is at play. I'm pleased the memory and the deeds of George and Rebecca Barnes, the original homeowners, are being protected and is stored here. Some of my ancestors, the Sedgwicks and the Tracys, spent time here. They were fellow abolitionists, and those letters, this home comes alive to me, particularly in my third great-grandfather Charles Sedgwick's letters, who lived up the street, and they were neighbors. And Lisa and I were speaking at lunch today that this area, James Street, was a residential district, really, only. And at the time, there were families, and they were raising their kids, and that's what this home was all about. And it was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. And as a little girl, when it was owned by the Corinthian Foundation, I took ballet lessons here, and I knew the history from my grandfather. I would come in and just think, oh my gosh, I wasn't so crazy about ballet, but I grew up with brothers, maybe that's why, but I think I was also just my father speaking in my head about these people that were here and being shuffled through, from the basement or the attic, and I could envision this. And my mother spent time here too with the Corinthian Foundation, the Meals on Wheels. So this is such an important home, and we would never want to lose it. So today here, I'll be speaking about 30 minutes. I know, thank you, this time with lunch and everything. And I'll be sharing with you the letters in life of my great-great-grandfather, Osgood Vose Tracy, who served the Union in the 122nd New York, which went out of Syracuse. And I'm happy to answer any questions afterward. I'll cover who Osgood was, his family and friends, and share a little bit about his wartime experience and post-war life. My journey with Osgood Vose Tracy, I must say, began with my maternal grandfather, John Tracy, and my grandfather lived right here too, in Sedgwick Farm on DeWitt Street. And I loved my grandfather, and I loved spending time with him. He lived around the corner from me in the house my mother grew up in. And when I was there at his home, he would set out on his dining room table the letters that Osgood wrote. There were over 208, mainly written to his widowed mother. And they were contained in 2 scrapbooks, which have been preserved down through the generations of our family. And also Osgood's bayonets, swords, rifles, and also the memorabilia of his younger brother, William Tracy, who also served. So all this material is out, and it just interested me from a very young age. And my grandfather at times would explain a battle. He'd get a textbook out with the battle maps, and that interested me, but it didn't interest me as much as Osgood's letters. I thought the handwriting was the most beautiful I'd ever seen, and I was drawn to the old paper and the fact that Osgood had written and dipped his pen in ink. I was curious about the photographs on the table, and in the photo album that Osgood left behind, I have it here, it's in the box, and I was just drawn to these people, his family and his sweetheart. That I was really drawn to. On special occasions, my grandfather let me take home something from the house. At times, it might have been a flower that Osgood picked up on a battlefield. Osgood's mother kept a scrapbook. He let me take that home, and I remember creating a jacket cover to that scrapbook. Actually, it's right here, and this is her wartime diary. That she began in 1862 when he left for war, and it actually continued through 1901, but I'll get into more about what's in that. So my grandfather really shared this history, and it came very alive to me. For me, the past never seemed far away. I was amazed, for instance, that my grandfather's mother, who I knew very well. She lived to be 97 and I was 10 years old, and she knew Osgood. You know, she married his son, and so I thought, that's just, to me, I was almost touching that point in time, that it just didn't seem far away. One moment, however, with my grandfather stands out to me like an epiphany. We were standing on Sedgwick Drive looking up at his childhood home, they called it the Tracy home, 107 Sedgwick Drive. And I just remember standing there, and he was talking about the letters again and everything. But he mentioned the abolition of slavery movement and all this, and I just thought, it just dawned on me right then and there that these letters were very important to history. It was bigger than just our immediate family, and I felt that the letters should be published, and perhaps one day the story be told in film. As I was a young girl who loved to read and write, I wanted to be the one to make that happen. I just remember thinking that. And it's still clear in my mind, that moment with my grandfather. Just a bit of background, Lisa already got into some. I studied history in college, and then I began working in publishing in Boston. And at that time, I knew that I did want to get started on this project, and I began to transcribe the original letters, actually from a typewritten form, into the computer. And then a family member had done the first transcription to typewriter, and then I fact-checked them, of course, and again for the book. And then I began to call on small presses, creating manuscripts. I worked with editors, and small presses were either sold or the editor moved on, so it didn't happen, and I got busy raising a family. But it remained important for me to do, to see this project through, and I never gave up on my dream. As Lisa mentioned, I began to write a historical novel, but again, I just felt like this was the book that should be published first, with the letters as they are. So I'm very pleased, and I'm appreciative of my collaborator, Ryan Keating, because he brings in what I couldn't about the details of Civil War history. We worked on it for about 5 years. Life gets in the way, so to speak, for each Ryan and myself, but that process of, if anyone has published a book through a university press or a large publisher, it takes time, and it did. Before I begin the slides, I'd just like to quote my great-grandfather. And on September 30th, 1863, Osgood was a year into service, and he wrote home to his mother, quote, "I trust you stow all my letters away in my chest, for I wish to preserve them." So, just grab a drink of water. And this is the cover to the book, which is Osgood, of course, there. This is my grandfather here, with his son-in-law, L. Atterbury, who actually transcribed them at first to typewriter. My grandfather was, as I said, interested in the history, and this was a news article by the Syracuse Herald on February 12th, 1981. Again, here was, these are the 2 scrapbooks of letters. This is the scrapbook I have with me today, and then the rifles and so forth.
Which gentleman is which?
I'm sorry, I meant to say that. My grandfather's holding the framed photo of his great uncle, William Tracy, or rather his uncle. This is me this past year with some of the same memorabilia. This is an 1850 view of Syracuse, New York, which is housed at OHA here, right in Syracuse. And as the nation stood on the precipice of Civil War, the town of Syracuse played a vibrant role in the national debates over slavery, as we've mentioned. And Osgood was born here on June 25th, 1840. This is the Tracy home, and it was located at 1017 James Street. And this is where Osgood was raised. This is Osgood's father, and he was born in Norwich, Connecticut. Osgood had, on both sides of his parents, had deep military roots. James Grant Tracy's father was Captain Jared Tracy, who had been commissary of supplies for the American Army during the siege of Boston. Here in Syracuse, James was a lawyer and a land agent, and he and Sarah Osgood married in 1836. James died in 1850 from heart trouble. Osgood was 10 years old. And at that point, he began to feel a deep responsibility for his mother. And 1850 was the year that the sectional compromise over slavery underpinned the national politics, as the Fugitive Slave Act permitted slave owners to pursue escaped African Americans across state lines and return them to captivity. This is Osgood's mother. She was born in Andover, Massachusetts today, which is North Andover. Her grandfather, Colonel Joseph Vose, was the colonel of the 1st Massachusetts Regiment during the Revolutionary War, and he worked directly with George Washington often. There were some letters that were in our family until 1958 from George Washington to Colonel Vose and Lafayette. And Sarah here moved from Andover, Massachusetts, which was close to where I lived when I was north of Boston, so I had fun getting to know the history there. She moved here to Syracuse in her late 20s with her half-sister. And this is Osgood's oldest brother. There were three brothers, as I mentioned here, and he was working in a coal office. He was about 25 years old when Osgood went off to war. This is Osgood's youngest brother, Will, as they called him. They had many nicknames for Will, which were kind of fun. As it says here, he was small in stature, full of patriotic spirit. They called him the captain when he became a captain. They called him the infant. And Willie were some nicknames. He joined the 3rd Regiment, New York, which was the first regiment to leave Syracuse here. He mustered in as corporal. And he had, says my collaborator, one of the most varied services of the Civil War, meaning he was kind of all over the place, and I'll get to that in a bit. This is their youngest brother, Edward, and sadly Edward died at age 6 of diphtheria, which is very common back then. It was only 4 months after Mr. Tracy had died, so this was a tough time. Osgood's childhood was marked by tragedy and triumph. This is Osgood's sweetheart, Nellie Sedgwick. And in this photograph, Nellie is about age 21, and it's taken in 1862, the year Osgood left for war. They had been dating several years, from what I can tell. She's a daughter of Charles Baldwin Sedgwick and Ellen Chase Smith. Ellen died in childbirth during the birth of Nellie's brother. So she was a young girl when she lost her mother. This is Charles Sedgwick. As I mentioned, he was a staunch abolitionist. He was helped found the Syracuse Vigilance Committee, and he represented the white men who freed from the jail here in Syracuse the escaped enslaved man named William Jerry Henry. Many of you have probably heard about the Jerry Rescue. Mr. Sedgwick was the first person to give a speech on the House floor in 1860 denouncing slavery. And a 2-term state congressman during the war. He married again a year later, and this is Deborah Gannett. Dora, as he called her. She was raised in Boston. She was an abolitionist, and it's thought that her her beliefs, or Charles's beliefs, grew that much stronger when he married her. She studied at a school called the Brook Farm. One of her published books was about Brook Farm. It was a transcendentalist school that Bronson Alcott started near Concord, Massachusetts. One of her classmates was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and she remained lifelong friends with him and the Alcott family. With Charles, she had 4 children. This was their home, the original Sedgwick farm in 1860, and that's Dora Forefront. I have the sketch at home. My mother wrote on the back the dates and the place. During the war, like I said, Dora was home here on their homestead, raising their 6 children and taking care of the home. They had bought, it was a total of 85 acres of land just up the hill here. Mr. Sedgwick called it the hill and the farm.
Is there this property actually or no? This property?
We'll wait till the questions at the end, but I'm sorry. No, it's further. It was up the road. And then there was a tragedy between the Sedgwicks and the Barnes. They were close friends. They were neighbors right here. And unfortunately, in April of 1862, while both sets of parents were out of town, Dora was actually visiting her husband in Washington, and while he was serving in Congress, their 12-year-old son, Frank, and Tommy Barnes, the only son of this George Barnes and his wife Rebecca, drowned in a pond that was actually created by a recent rainstorm. The snow's melting, and sadly the boys didn't make it. And just to speak to that a little bit about Sedgwick, had to go back to Washington, and he wrote about how they had to keep on the fight. They were always, even in this awful tragedy, they had to keep fighting to free the slaves. This is just part of what appeared in the Syracuse news report about the boys. These are the Barnes, George and Rebecca. Here you've probably seen this photograph, and the man, this is their marriage, and standing on the right is Reverend Joseph May, who's an abolitionist of May Memorial Church. He was, interestingly, the brother of Bronson Alcott's, of Abigail Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's mother. Getting to Osgood here, enlisting. This is an enlistment. And in June 1862, President Lincoln called for 300,000 more volunteers. Osgood was 22 years old and working in a bank, supporting his widowed mother in their home. Feeling that deep responsibility and pull to be here, he waited to join for 16 months, not because he was unpatriotic, but because his duty was here at that time. But he finally did enlist. His brother Will had been at war since the start, like I mentioned. He was appointed Sergeant Major in Company 1. And we'll move on here. And the week before he left home, he proposed to Nellie. And as he wrote later in a letter to his mother, she said no. And he had a ring made by a local jeweler that he was very excited about. We're left to wonder why Nellie said no. My theory is that it was 4 months after the tragedies of the boys drowning. And she was 21 years old at that time, and she may very well have been at home responsible for her half-brother, Frank. So perhaps she said no because she wouldn't accept happiness into her life yet, which an engagement would afford. Before the regiment left home, there was a great rally in Fayetteville, New York, for the 122nd, which was comprised of 1,000 men. So this was a big event. It was a hot day, and they arrived from all over Onondaga County. The 122nd was comprised of men, mainly farmers' sons, and they gathered in Fayetteville. And this woman, an abolitionist who lived in Fayetteville, gave a great speech, and she made it very clear to the men that they were fighting for the, slavery was a cause of the war, and they were to fight for the freedom of all. She said, not one sect, not one clique, but all men, women, and children, no matter their color. The regiment had 2 days training on the land that's now today the state fairgrounds. They then boarded trains on August 31, and Osgood wrote this first letter home to his mother on September 3rd from Baltimore, Maryland. The regiment arrived in Sharpsburg, Maryland, just after the fighting concluded at the Battle of Antietam, which took place on September 17. This one-day battle is still to date the single bloodiest day in American history. 22,720 men were killed that day, one day. 12,400 were Union. And as I have here, Osgood wrote, this gave us a rather realizing sense of the war. They had hardly been gone 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks maybe, leaving the comfort of their homes. And they did not participate in the battle, but they were there witnessing it and helping the next day, collecting bodies and awful things like that. The regiment, the 122nd, was assigned to the Army of the Potomac, the 6th Army Corps, and it was led by General John Sedgwick here. General Sedgwick was from Cornwall, Connecticut. He was the first cousin to Charles Sedgwick. Osgood's correspondence continued unabated throughout the war, interrupted only twice for these two situations. One was a guard duty, and what we'll get to is he was captured in battle and imprisoned, so he couldn't write letters at that point. Osgood's mother began to collect his letters, and at some point they were placed, these are the covers to the scrapbooks, and this on the left is my great-grandmother's handwriting. She was an interested historian and writer. It's just a photograph of one of the letters written on February 14th. Sometimes he would, design something and show her something, a sketch in the letters. And as, like I mentioned, as Osgood began to send the letters home, she kept this scrapbook. And she pasted things that were of interest to her, wartime articles, many about abolitionists, and the flowers that Osgood sent home. Also within the scrapbook are, there's an execution order that he sent home. Also his signed announcement to the Army of the Potomac that President Lincoln had been assassinated. So she just kept things that were of interest to her. And her obituary is within this scrapbook, and it states that she was an abolitionist herself. It's just more of the mementos. This were roses before Petersburg in March 1865. As we all, read in books and see in movies, the Band of Brothers, that sort of thing, that was real for Osgood. And many of the men that he went to war with, he knew they were friends or acquaintances. Some were not, some he met there. This man, front and center, is Frank Worcester. Above, he did not know Frank. He was a lawyer from Tully, New York. Some of his other friends, Davis Cossett. There was a popular Cossett's Corner in Syracuse. He was a popular farmer, and Guy Gotches, and these men, Osgood described fun, popular, convincing, and in the book it gives more of his descriptions of his friends, but they traveled through this war experience with him, and they were brothers, and so important to each other. Also, who was so important to him was his younger brother, and this is Will here. This is Osgood with a hat, and this is the 6 Corps insignia. It's half hidden, it's a cross. And Will, I should just mention, he is holding a wounded arm. So this is, I know, taken late spring or summer of 1863. We'll get to that. Whoops. Wounding later. Sorry. There we go. There was extended family in war. This is Osgood's uncle and General Edwin Vose Sumner. He was a brigadier general. He actually died here in Syracuse on route west. He was to go on, and he was the oldest field commander, north or south, and he died at age 70. And his funeral was held here at his daughter's home, Sarah Sumner Teal. These were Osgood's cousins. He was close to the man below, Sam Sumner. They would try to see each other in field and camp. In the weeks following Antietam, the 122nd was ordered to chase the enemy, and then on November 2nd, they received orders to move south. Oh, and at this time, they donned the regiment, the Flying Onondagas, for good old county here. During the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia, in December 11th through the 15th, more than 12,500 Army of the Potomac soldiers were killed. A Confederate victory with a loss of 6,000 men. The winter snows arrived and the roadways turned to mud. The men of the 122nd settled into the winter camps at this time. And Osgood had a chance. He missed a couple days of the mud march. He would often try to get a furlough for a night or two, a couple days to go over to Washington when Nellie was in Washington visiting her father. So he was always trying to see her and trying to rectify their relationship or understand it. This was just the time frame when he did happen to be able to see her. At this time, the regiment was encountering enemy pickets, newly liberated slaves, and the destruction of southern plantations. Osgood was promoted to 2nd lieutenant. Let's see here. And then in the wake of the victory at Battle of Chancellorsville, General Lee turned his army north towards Gettysburg. At the time, Gettysburg was sort of an unknown name to these men, but as we know it today, it isn't. And I just need to gather my book that I forgot to put out. And I'll just read. It's nice to hear from Osgood directly. Halting only for the occasional 5 minutes rest and twice to make coffee, we struggled on through that hot July day, nerved to renewed efforts as the sound of the battle grew louder and louder. We reached the banks of Rock Creek, just in the rear of the battlefield at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and redeemed the promise our noble Sedgwick made the night before. "Tell General Meade," he said to the staff officers who brought him the order, "Tell General Meade I will be at Gettysburg with my corps at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon." Part of our corps was engaged that night, marching onto the field after their long and arduous march, assisted in relieving the 3rd Corps. Our brigade went into bivouac a little in rear of the front line of battle, sleeping on our arms. We men roused again before daylight and moved over to Culp's Hill, our extreme right, and for a short time we were in reserve, but Lee was making a desperate attempt to turn our right, and a regiment in front of us, having got out of our ammunition, we were ordered forward to take their places. We charged across the knoll and reoccupied the breastworks, which, with other regiments on our right and left, we held against their repeated charges until they abandoned their attack in despair. While behind the breastworks and in the midst of the fight, a regiment moved up and took the place of one of our immediate left, and it proved to be the 149th New York, organized in the county the next month after ours, and which belonged to the 12th Corps. This was the only time during the war that we met as regiments. He wrote this post-war for a speech. During that morning's fight, we had 10 men killed and 34 wounded, which was a large proportion to the number actually engaged, as our numbers had been considerably decreased by our long and arduous march. For an hour or two, there was a lull in the battle. Then was opened that terrific artillery fire, which was intended to sweep the crest of Cemetery Ridge of our batteries and troops, preparatory to Pickett's famous charge. This is a painting of Culp's Hill. On July 4th, from Gettysburg, Osgood wrote his mother twice. So this is the day after the battles. And he wrote, "We had a hard fight yesterday, Mother. We had 10 men killed, 31 wounded, besides Major Davis, who had his jaw broken, and Lieutenant LaRue, who was wounded in the thigh. They were the only officers who were wounded. 2 men, one on each side of me, were wounded, but I escaped unhurt. Our regiment behaved splendidly. Major Randall of the 149th had just shaken hands with me before he was hit. We drove the Rebs away from the stone wall by which they lay by the heavy fire behind our breastworks. The Rebs were repulsed at every point, and on our left, their loss is very heavy, much more so than ours. We have taken a large number of prisoners. All is quiet this morning. I guess we had our celebration yesterday. P.S. I enclose a wild rose picked up on the field and an old execution." During this time, Osgood, in the fall of 1863, reflected on the U.S. colored troops, and Reverend Samuel Joseph May, an abolitionist reverend here, which I mentioned earlier, sent Osgood abolitionist material, which he read and handed out to the men. And it's clear in his letters that his beliefs on abolition of slavery grew stronger as the war continued. As the new year dawned, the regiment received orders in the middle of the night to board trains. The letters in the book speak of this. There was first fear, where are we going? Why are we getting on a train? The men didn't know until they were a little bit on their way, and they were very pleased with what they learned. They were leaving the front lines of war to head to Johnson's Island on Lake Erie for prison guard duty. And this is the prison. It was a Union prison for Confederate officers. And Osgood wrote here in this post-war note within the scrapbook, the rebel prisoners were well fed, clean, comfortably housed, and well treated, in great contrast to the condition and treatment of our poor fellows in southern prisons. At this point in time, Osgood's mother paid him a visit, which was nice. And this letter was from Osgood's landlord. The men, the officers could house in town. They were allowed to pick their place where they would stay. The privates were on the island with the prisoners. They had their own barracks. So it was an exciting time for these men to be away. This was one point that I mentioned earlier, that there are no letters within the scrapbook, but it was clear that he was writing, because there were some letters saying, you know, my letters now that I'm left Sandusky won't be as exciting. So we wonder where are those letters, and did Osgood choose to not include them or burn them? I don't know. He may have. It's very possible. Returning from the island, the regiment marched forward in a campaign that would ultimately take 1 year and lead to the Confederacy's destruction. The road to Richmond was 70 miles long, blocked by the Army of Northern Virginia. What remained of the 122nd cast into the fray engaged with the enemy more often than in any time prior in their service. During the Battle of the Wilderness in this tangly forest, which took place May 5 through the 7th, they lost 119 men, countless others, and many captured. Among those captured was Osgood. There was great chaos in this battle. There were fires and people were getting lost. They were they had been fighting face to face, and even at that point, Osgood wrote about having what gave him courage was thinking about his great-grandfather, Colonel Vose, who had fought in the Revolutionary War face to face, and that gave him courage to fight on. But he soon found himself with a group of men and surrounded by 20 of them were surrounded by Confederates and told to throw down their weapons. And they were imprisoned in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a Warwick prison, it was called. And I would just do another reading here. This is Osgood's words about how that capture occurred. As we advanced through the thick woods, on the morning of the 6th of May, 1864, we had quite a sharp skirmish, but finally gained a little crest where we established our line, throwing up a breastwork of logs. The rebels were in line a short distance in our front, also behind breastworks. With the light of later information, let's start here. Just before dusk, as I and several of my messmates were eating our supper, a sharp firing began on the picket line, which had been established on our flank. The picket line fell back, followed by a charging, yelling line of rebels. A flank attack is always demoralizing, and the men fell back from the breastworks in front, forming a line at right angles to their former position to meet the new attack. At the same time, the rebel line in our old front commenced to advance, firing, and all was confusion. We were driven back to one of the narrow roads I spoke of, where I found General Shaler, our brigade commander, and Generals Sedgwick and Wright, our corps and division commanders, busily engaged in rallying a line of men. Among those of our regiment who were taken prisoners that night and who still live here in Syracuse, this was a reunion speech, are Ostrander, Hubbs, Manzer, and Austin. The three former were wounded, and both Ostrander and Hubbs had amputations of the leg and foot performed by rebel surgeons. The enemies killed, according to the account kept by the Pioneer Office, amounted to nearly 400, among them one brigade commander. Several hundred prisoners were captured, among them 2 brigade commanders. But besides them, many hundreds were passed to the rear and made their escape in the darkness. I must be permitted to add that had the movement been made at an earlier hour and properly supported, each brigade being brought into action as its front was cleared, it would have resulted in a decided disaster to the whole right wing of Grant's army. For weeks, Osgood's whereabouts were unknown. And as you can imagine, this created a lot of anxiety and worry here on the home front and in Syracuse. And many people wrote letters, including his mother, trying to find out what they could. I will just read so you can hear his mother's voice. A letter from her. She wrote to him, obviously not knowing if he'd receive it. I don't know where she mailed it to, probably wherever she'd been mailing his letters. My dear darling boy, you can well imagine the overwhelming anxiety which is torturing me today, and although I received your kind letter last evening noticing my birthday and exhorting me to try not to feel anxious, quote, I have not succeeded, but feel as if I can hardly bear the state of suspense to which I am doomed. Sunday, precludes our getting the telegraph dispatches. The news we have thus far received is meager, but fills me with alarm as we learn there has been severe fighting and that 4,000 on our side have been wounded, including several officers of high command. Captain Cossack called last evening on his way to Washington. He thought the Sixth Corps had not been seriously engaged, but I saw that they had crossed immediately after the 5th, much to my surprise. I also saw Frank Lester at church. He was a quartermaster in the regiment. And he will take this letter and has faithfully promised to take care of you if you have been wounded and give me the earliest information. So Osgood, as I mentioned, was captured and then he was imprisoned in Warwick House Prison in Lynchburg. He met there a lieutenant by the name of Mortimer Birdseye. And together, during the first 10 days of imprisonment, they decided to plan an escape. They studied a map that they found in this house prison to study the lay of the land so that they would know if they were able to get out successfully, how they would go and trek north. For $10 Confederate script that Osgood luckily had on him when he came into the prison and that they didn't take from him, he convinced a slave cook one evening to give him a Confederate uniform, and Birdseye had one as well. On one night, when they felt that the time was right, there was a procession of guards leaving the prison, and they were able to slip out with them. And this is a map I had produced. There's one actually in the original that was in the news article that was printed here in Syracuse of the route these two men took. And they were on the run for 18 nights, again, disguised. They went, they foraged for food when they could, but they became so hungry they had to approach plantations. They met all sorts of people. They were nearly shot several times. They met the John Mosby himself. And they met people who knew they were federal, escaped prisoners that helped them. Birdseye's shoes wore out one day, and they he could hardly go on. His feet were sore. They met a cobbler slave who took them into their home and into his home, and he repaired his Birdseye's shoes. And I'll just say, I shouldn't have changed the slide yet, but the news stories that were published upon Osgood's return are detailed, and they're within the book. And actually, I think this is one of them. Yes, wartime experiences of two Onondaga County boys, escaping from rebel prison. the brutality of war. Here Osgood was 18 nights on the run, had been, exhausted, hungry. He arrives to Harper's Ferry, the both of them, and they decided that he would go put himself out there first to the Union men guarding Harper's Ferry, and they nearly shot him. They thought it was a Confederate, and just within an hour of, he must have been so elated, and then he learns that his best friend, Frank Worcester, had been killed at the Battle of Cold Harbor, which took place while Osgood had been imprisoned during his trek. And, he talked about Frank Worcester all of his life in speeches. And so these men, not just Osgood, just, the loss that they encountered, the wounds and so forth, and then the loss, the deaths of their good friends and comrades were very difficult, of course. Like I mentioned, Osgood and Birdseye were welcomed home heroes. And this is the news article that was published. That one is actually in Birdseye's, that was a later version. There was one right away that Osgood was interviewed for. It's very detailed about everywhere they went and who they met, and it's pretty fascinating. It's in the book. The citizens, good citizens here in Syracuse, New York, presented Osgood this sword. It's called a presentation sword, I've learned. It's inscribed with O.V. Tracy, 122nd, and they wrote him a very nice letter thanking him for his service. He had a 2-week furlough, and then back he went. I'll just share briefly, hopefully for you all, Will Tracy, his younger brother, I feel like I need to speak to him a little too. He, like I said, was very patriotic. He actually left the regiment that he joined here after a while because he felt that other men were just as deserving of that position. He felt he'd been given the position due to family connections, and he wrote his mother from Louisville, Kentucky, said he was joining, he had left and was joining a regiment where he knew no one, and if he rose in the ranks, he would, and if not, he would stay as a private. Well, he rose in the ranks, and back he came, and he was the aide to General Henry Slocum, who Will cared very much for, and so he carried out messages often for him. And during the Battle of Chancellorsville, which took place on May 2nd, he was given an order to bring to a General Williams, which was important. It would change the direction the general took in this battle, and he was able to get the order to the general. He, however, on his way back on horseback, found himself in enemy territory. It was getting dark. There was a full moon, and as the moon came out, it became clear that he was a Federal riding in Confederate lines, and General A.P. Hill gave the order, shoot him, kill him. And he had to decide, originally they asked him to halt and give up, and he decided not to. And he made the decision to ride down the path, to freedom or his death. This is Will at this time. He was wounded, and he was shot at in his arm. It was the arm that he didn't ride with, he wrote. You can see how young he is. 4 inches of the bone of his arm was taken out. It was revolutionary surgery, and rather than amputating it. The bone, my grandfather told me, was in the Smithsonian Institute. And I finally found it was there, and it was at least until the 1980s. This was a post-war photo of Will. You can see the arm. So the end of war is in sight now. It's the winter of 1865. The regiment has had settled into these trenches around Petersburg. Osgood and Nellie began to write more frequently. And again, I'll just say throughout the war, they wrote, not frequently, but occasionally, but he was always writing his mother about Nellie and worrying that she'd find another suitor. And there were other suitors. In fact, one of his old clique comrades, Frank Lester, who was the quartermaster, would often make trips home for supplies. Well, he learned he was also visiting Nellie on these trips home. So, these men always felt left behind too, for the men that were here, that were living their lives and not at war, and people were still getting married and going to dances, and his frustration and worry were in his letters throughout the war, but they were beginning to write more. President Lincoln was assassinated April 15th, 1865. This is Charles Sedgwick in downtown Syracuse. There were thousands of people. The photo which is at the OHA is quite interesting. There's just people out in their the buildings all around listening to this speech, and actually Lincoln's body, Charles Sedgwick had been, he was asked to be on the train that brought Lincoln's body through here. They were close friends, and he gave this speech here. And the soldiers, knowing the war is coming, there's excitement, of course. They are thrilled it's coming to an end, but they also had trepidation about coming home. How would they fit in? What would they do for work? Their jobs were long gone. They'd been gone years. Osgood had been gone 3 years. Many had been gone 4 and a half. One of his good friends wrote this: "You must go home now and comfort your mother." He was mustered out June 23rd, and the regiment headed home. And I'll read this quote in case someone can't read from there. Osgood wrote his mother May 11th, 1865, "I don't believe there will be any desire to attempt another rebellion until the memory of this shall have perished, which will at least ensure peace to my great-grandchildren." Whoops. Osgood took a job with a wholesale company. He eventually founded this O.V. Tracy Coffee and Company. He asked Nellie again for her hand in marriage. They were married in 1867. The reception was held at the Sedgwick home. They had 4 sons. They were Cornell University graduates between 1891 and 1898. This was their daughter, Sarah, whose photo I just recently was shown from my mother's cousin. And she did pass diphtheria at age 4. And that's Nellie, I guess around probably 35 years old, wearing the locket with her daughter's photograph. The Tracy family continued to run O.V. Tracy Company until about 1950. My mother talked about filling these coffee cans, which we have a few left, on weekends or after school with her 22 cousins, whenever they could get a hold of a few of them. Osgood gave many speeches after the war. He liked to speak to young audiences. I have one here with me today, right here, and it says, "To those of us who participated, the events of the war seem so real that we forget the years that have passed." And he would say it was hard to believe that some people in the audience were younger than he was when he left for war. His brother Will gave wonderful speeches. He was a wonderful writer. I wish we had more of his letters. I don't know what happened to them. There's some within these 2 scrapbooks of letters. But his speeches focused on the need to help veterans and their families. He was very frustrated with the state of New York not putting up monuments as quickly as the state of Massachusetts and others, Pennsylvania, were doing. This is at their 20th reunion. This is Osgood here, probably about 45 years old. This was at Long Branch Park. It was the 24th reunion where Will spoke, and I'll just read this paragraph. He said, "We shall never cease to feel a thrill of pride, so long as we continue to breathe, that in the morning of our lives, when everything was at its brightest and its best, when the dew was on the flower and the night was on the wave, when life was still, the rose's hope while yet unknown, that we were willing to sacrifice it all, to give up the full pleasures of this world which we had just begun to experience as men, to throw down our work, to destroy our careers we had marked out for ourselves. Our lives were as sweet, our happiness as dear to us then, as the life and happiness are now to the men who walk our streets today. Yet we were willing to surrender all without hesitation." At this reunion at Long Branch Park, Will started up a fund. He and Osgood put first money in for a regiment monument. They said, let's get this done by the 25th reunion of Gettysburg. And here it was 1 year later. For our foes in the North, whom we left behind us, he said, and who continually endeavored to obstruct the progress of the war, we can only feel contempt. It is a satisfaction to think that the name of Copperhead will remain a brand of disgrace for successive generations. Copperheads were those that didn't believe it in the abolition of slavery. And Osgood, this is his speech at the 25th Gettysburg reunion, which I have with me today. And this is the original that he wrote, and it's printed in one of the volumes of the New York regiments at Gettysburg. And you can read it in the book and in that book as well. Osgood and Nellie, in 1902, just shortly before his death, returned to the South to visit the prison that he had been housed in. Unfortunately, they found it taken down. But the two men trekked, they were in their cars this time, and they trekked the 200 miles again, and they even met some of the people that they had met along the way, which is pretty neat. Their eldest son, Osgood and Nellie's actually second son, James Brant Tracy, married this woman here in the photograph on the porch, and she was a Southerner. She was from Rome, Georgia. She'd taken a train to Cornell to meet a girlfriend for a long weekend, and she met James from Syracuse, New York. They were married in 1901. This is her father, the larger photo, and he fought for the Confederacy and Stevens rifles, along with her two brothers. This is the family together. This is the Confederate, and Nellie here and Osgood and their sons. And I recall my great-grandmother saying that, people would ask her, what was the atmosphere of this wedding? And, it was 36 years after the Civil War ended, and she said it was cordial but cool. And she left her home there, that's their home, and came north and lived here in Syracuse, right on 107 Sedgwick Drive. And, only got back a handful of times. Osgood's oldest brother became a civil engineer and surveyor. He was interested in steam railroads, and he was an organizer of the Syracuse Savings Bank. He spent time in the South. He never married. This is Will Tracy, who became a lawyer here in Syracuse. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor I've forgotten right now what year, but for that deed at Chancellorsville, getting the message to the general safely and getting back to Union lines. His general put in for that medal, and it was bestowed upon him post-war. It's written up in the Deeds of Valor book. That right here is that, and we have that book, and the other photo of him on horseback is within there. This was called an escutcheon that's in our family, and it was given to Will. It's a painting of all the different battles that he participated in. Again, one of those very services all over the different theaters. And his Medal of Honor is down below there in the painting. Osgood's mother in Syracuse was the original trustee of Memorial Hospital. She died at age 97, just 2 weeks after driving her favorite 2 pair of horses. So I love that. And she enjoyed conversation with young people. Osgood did live to play with grandchildren and keep them safe, as he said he'd hoped to do. He's here with our oldest grandchild. Nellie's kind of behind him there. The top is torn off, but actually, and that's his grandchild that was named after him. They called him Otz, and I remember him. And this is a painting that's in our family of Osgood and Nellie in later years. I end here with Osgood. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear this presentation. And I'll just read this last thing from him. Actually, it's not from Osgood. This was what I was going to read. So this journey that I've been on, it's a long journey. If I say how long, I'll age myself. But I'll just say, I felt like I was becoming my grandfather in a way, sharing. I realized after, my mother is passed, and my grandfather clearly, and my children don't know the neighborhood I grew up in, or they don't remember my grandfather, and I became the person that was telling the stories. And I realized that, for that it was important to get Osgood's letters published. I'm sure, if someone else might have, but I felt like, oh my gosh, I've got to get this done. So I'm so pleased. And that 50 years after my grandfather first shared our ancestors' history with me, the Civil War, I'll say, still resonates with me the same way, that it doesn't seem that long ago. And these letters, I believe, teach us about who wrote them, their loved ones, their hardships, and the state of the country and our city here in Syracuse, which was a hotbed of, like I said, the anti-slavery movement, which we should all be very proud of. I know I am. And history itself helps enlighten us not only to our past, but our present and our future, enabling us to make informed decisions for ourselves, communities, and our country. I'm very pleased to have fulfilled my dream of publishing Osgood's letters. And most of all, though, I am extremely proud of my ancestors, their brave comrades, and their families who volunteered to help create a nation of free men and women. Yes.
I cannot imagine what a beautiful gift this is to your grandfather. To your grandfather.
Oh, yes.
And to your children.
Yes. I do. If my grandfather knew, and I believe they know. And
I do too.
Yes,
How
I
can
do.
you imagine anything better than knowing that your grandchild has taken this information and done this?
Thank you. Yeah, I feel very good about
And
that.
also, as soon as you showed that, I felt vindicated in all of the stuff that I had.
Yes.
Because I say all the time, I really should get rid of this. No!
Don't get rid
Don't
of
get rid of it! No!
Take it to the OHA. Yes, you had your hand up first.
A jacket happen to be vintage?
Oh no, it's so funny. I got this because it is kind of Civil War look. I have another long black one. How I wish I had Osgood or Will's uniforms, you know.
Have you in your studies run across something about, it's either Jefferson Davis's daughter or
Oh.
Robert E. Lee's daughter that came here incognito into Syracuse? Did you hear anything about that?
Yeah, so in my nonfiction work, you know, creating footnotes, and I wanted to mention whoever was mentioned by Osgood in his letters. The press had different ideas, you know, books can't be too long, but I got what I wanted. I wanted, you know, people mentioned, and so I discovered that it's a great story. Actually, the OHA has written a fantastic story on this, but the Confederate President Davis's daughter, Winnie, was in love with John Wilkinson's grandson, and the Wilkinsons here, friends of the Barnes and the Sedgwicks, was an abolitionist. Well, the Confederate president didn't like that, and there was an engagement, and then it was called off. Yes. Yeah.
I think I read that.
Yes, she used to
I don't know
visit.
where I saw it. It must have been in the papers.
I don't believe she ever married, and he didn't either.
Neither did
Yes,
Robert Lee.
Carol.
Is the book available on tape or download digital?
It's not yet, but that's a great point, and
I
I
would
will
love to
I will
hear
get
it
back to you on that.
With
Yes,
all that stuff.
good idea. Thank you.
We do
Yes.
have the books for sale, so,
Oh, yes,
and
I'm-
Sarah, will you be signing?
Yes, I can sign.
So, this is
would like-
Matt Burden, some of you may have seen him. Matt's our retail manager at OHA, and he'll be out there ready to, give you a book if you're interested. They're, for sale for $58, and we'll take cash, credit, or, a check.
Quick question, maybe you said, maybe I missed it, but, the letter that Sarah wrote to Osgood when he was in Confederate prison, did he ever receive that letter? She didn't know if he would.
Yes, he did
He did.
receive it because it's within the scrapbook.
Oh.
Yes, so it must have, I imagine that she sent it to, you know, his regiment wherever they were located, and they held on to it for him.
I've gotta say one quick thing, I have to go for a
Okay,
minute, but
yes.
I was fascinated to hear the abolitionist material that was handed out, because I have two great uncles who came from enslavement, one in Tennessee
Interesting.
and one in Virginia.
Wow. Mhm.
One was brought back from Virginia with a surgeon from the 126th at the Maddox Courthouse.
Mm.
The other one from Chancellorsville,
Mm.
from a battle there, from a guy who lived in Mansfield.
Oh.
And I've always wondered, how can this be so coincidental that two of these enslaved men
Mhm.
were brought back with Civil War soldiers to Central New York, and they each married sisters of my grandfather.
Oh, fascinating story.
Wow.
It's just an amazing
Right.
coincidence. And
Whether they came
I
back
thought,
with soldiers.
well, probably the men who were serving were abolitionists and saw these enslaved children,
Yes.
they were only children, and said, you know, come on back
Yes.
with me, you know, bring me north.
Huh.
But how, it's just an amazing coincidence.
Oh,
Two
and
sisters.
that Underground Railroad,
Two
you know, it's
Underground
working
Railroads.
everywhere, it wasn't just underground, it was everywhere. Is anyone else? Yes.
I'm just wondering, so Osgood is your grandfather's grandfather or father?
So Osgood is my great grandfather, so he was,
Two great, yeah, two great. So your
yes,
grandfather's.
yes, so he was, let's say, well, he was my maternal grandfather's grandfather.
Okay, that's.
Yes.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yes, Chris.
Did he pass away here in Syracuse?
Yes, he did in
And is he-
1909.
where
He is
is-
buried here. Many of the family, Tracy's and Sedgwick's, are in Oakwood, beautiful Oakwood Cemetery. Yeah, and Medal of Honor, Will's Medal of Honor monument, or you know, there's a white monument. I have a website. Sarah Tracy Burrows is my pen name. My original name. I have my website, Sarah Tracy Burrows, so .com, and there are a lot of pictures of the different, a lot of this is on there. Yes.
I'm just trying to get a lay of the Sedgwick track and where,
Okay.
Charles Sedgwick's home was, but you were saying that, Osgood and Nellie Sedgwick were married, they had their vows in the Sedgwick home, was that Charles Sedgwick's home?
Yes, it was, yes, so, yes, it was Charles and Dora Sedgwick's home that I showed you in that sketch.
Like,
And that was the original farm, and
Yeah.
then Osgood and Nellie's second son, James Grant Tracy, became a land agent lawyer, and they divided,
Right.
each of the sons built a house in the farm area. They wanted all the kids, the cousins, to be around each other, and then, when Charles and, Deborah died, it was actually in their wills that it would be subdivided, and to you know, they thought, and have, residents enjoy it. It was too much land and at that period of time for them, and yeah, I have the deeds of the sale, and so yes, that was,
Do you know,
that's
like,
where they were.
where exactly, it would have been, the Charles Sedgwick home?
The Charles Sedgwick home was actually on James Street.
Yeah, it's
Right, but
there was a house that's just recently been sold in the past few weeks. It was in 2 weeks ago paper that said it was the first house that was built in Sedgwick Farm.
Oh,
So I'm curious whether or not it
that's
was,
interesting.
it's-
I'll have to look.
Well, that's the one that-
The Charles Sedgwick house, unfortunately, is gone, but the original, yes, but.
because Matilda Gage,
Yes.
Goslin,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Goslin
There's a
did.
museum.
It was on the kitty corner on Park and DeWitt Street.
Okay.
And right in that section is supposedly this, the first home of
Interesting.
Sedgwick.
I'll have to look that up. But, a lot, you know, and then they face different ways. Like I remember, one of the family's homes, if you go down Sedgwick Drive, the first one on the left I love, it's actually with the white pillars. And that, you know, it's interesting to me because that definitely that design was, it's Southern, and that was my great grandmother, you know, and that they wanted to make something that looked Southern, and, you know, so those three, they were in the first block, so 107 was in, I think the third house, so. But what I was going to say is that I think the White House, the original, like the front of the house is actually on the back side, so it's, I remember hearing about that. Any other questions? Thank you so much for sticking it out.